The sound cracked through the silence, like thunder in a funeral, and the dog's body hit the dirt before the man could even take a breath. He didn't scream, he didn't run, he just knelt, arms open, palms up, eyes wide, like the bullet had passed through his own heart. The dog twitched once, then never again. The officer's voice barked something about perceived threats and protocol, but all the man could hear was the last whimper of the only soul on earth who had never judged him. Blood soaked into the grass, while the other officers lowered their weapons, slowly realizing, maybe too late, that something had shifted in the air. Not Fernet panics, something colder. He stood up slow, like the ground was fighting him, like gravity itself was trying to keep him down, and for one long moment he just looked at them all with those eyes that had once stared down death in the dark jungles of countries no one talks about in polite company. There were medals in a dusty box under his bed back home, and scars no one ever saw, and a file in some locked cabinet that read classified so many times it might as well have been written in smoke. But right now none of that mattered. Right now there was just the weight in his chest and the silence that followed. Violence and the dog that wouldn't get back up. They told him to calm down. They told him to stand still. They reached for his wrists with cuffs already gleaming, and he let them, not because he was weak, not because he was scared, but because there was something more powerful than rage bubbling in his veins. Purpose. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know what they'd done. Not really. They thought they'd just taken down a threat, but they'd lit a fuse in the dark and walked away without waiting for the explosion. The station was cold and reeked of sweat and old coffee. He sat across from a young cop with tired eyes and too clean shoes, who asked him questions like name and occupation and next of kin. He answered slowly, like he had to translate every word from a language he hadn't spoken in years. They called him Mr. Nash. But that wasn't the name he used when he was overseas, and that wasn't the name whispered by men who feared him. He was processed and released with a warning and a paper in a manila envelope that didn't explain why the dog had to die. They said the dog charged, that it looked aggressive, that they had no choice. But Nash had trained that dog himself, hand-fed it, slept beside it, talked to it like it was the last thread connecting him to a world that once made sense, and now the thread was cut. He walked home in the rain, because walking made more sense than driving, and because something inside him needed to feel every drop like a cleansing. Or maybe a reckoning. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, and no one said a word because they knew Nash was quiet and private and not to be disturbed, and they never asked why he screamed in his sleep, or why his hands sometimes shook when he held a coffee mug. He buried the dog in the backyard under the oak tree with no marker, just a stone he found near the river where they used to run together in the early mornings before the world woke up. Then he sat beside the grave and whispered something in a language the wind carried away. The next day he started digging, not in the dirt, not for revenge, not yet, but into the past, into every file and name and badge number tied to the ones who had come onto his land with guns and fear and poor judgment. He found gaps in their reports. He found inconsistencies in the footage, and he found something he didn't expect, and in one he hadn't heard in over a decade. A name that belonged to a man who shouldn't be wearing a badge, a name tied to Black Ops missions that never officially happened, and bodies that were never officially found. Nash leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen as the rain tapped the window like fingers impatient for action. It wasn't just about the dog anymore. Something bigger was moving beneath the surface, like a current pulling him into a storm. He didn't start, but might just finish. That night he dreamed of fire and sand, and a voiceover come screaming his name through the static. He woke up sweating, heart racing, eyes locked on the ceiling like he expected it to fall. In there was someone out there, someone from the old days, someone who had disappeared with a secret and now wore a badge and carried a gun and gave orders to men who didn't question a that someone had ordered the shot not out of Fernat by mistake, but as a warning or a test. Nash didn't know which one yet, but he would soon. He opened the old footlocker in the attic for the first time in years. Side were pieces of a life, he thought. He'd buried 4 good dog tags with blood still etched in the grooves, folded letter that once saved his life, a pistol wrapped in oilcloth, a photo of a team that no longer existed with half the faces crossed out in red ink. He laid it all out on the floor like puzzle pieces waiting for meaning. One face in the photo matched the name on the report: Lieutenant Jace Monroe, dead as of 2013 according to the official record, but not dead, not anymore, not if Nash's gut was right, and it usually was. Monroe, man who once saved Nash's life in Kabul and then tried to end it in Benghazi. Man who vanished after an op went sideways, leaving 6 dead and 1 alive, and now that one had lost his dog to a bullet from a department run by a god. Didn't make sense yet, but it would. Everything does eventually. You just have to dig deep enough. And Nash was ready to start digging the next morning. A black SUV parked across the street, stayed idling for over an hour. Nash noticed, of course he noticed. He sat on the porch sipping bitter coffee and watching with the stillness of a predator in tall grass. He didn't wave, he didn't blink. Eventually, the SUV drove off, but not before the driver looked straight at him. Nash saw something in the man's eyes that made the hairs on his arms stand up. Recognition, not just of who Nash was, but of what he was later that day. Nash's mailbox was smashed. Not random message. He smiled without joy. They remembered. They thought he was still that broken shell trying to heal through silence and walks in the woods and the love of a loyal animal. They thought wrong. The man they remembered was buried long ago. What they didn't know was that the one who replaced him was far more dangerous, because he had nothing left to lose. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was too sharp, too calculated, like the quiet before a sniper pulls the trigger. Nash moved through his house like a man on autopilot, muscle memory guiding him where emotions had long stopped trying. He opened the small panel behind the coat closet, a space no one ever noticed, not even the neighbor who once borrowed sugar, and glanced around. Too long inside were the old files, the ones he had kept even when ordered to destroy them, because a part of him always knew that ghosts don't stay buried forever. He pulled out the black folder labeled Indigo Night, a name only 5 people had ever said out loud, and 2 of them were confirmed dead. 1 went missing, and the 4th was Nash himself. 5th was Jason Rother. Folder was filled with coordinates, maps, coded messages, photos of buildings that no longer existed, and names that had been redacted even from his copy. But he knew what he was looking for. He wasn't chasing a theory. He was hunting a memory. The SUV didn't return that night, but Nash didn't sleep. He sat by the window staring at the dark trees and listening to every rustle, every branch snap, every whisper of wind, like it might be hiding footsteps. He had lived like this once in the jungle, when night meant death and quiet meant someone was moving close enough to smell your breath. He didn't flinch when his phone vibrated at 3 a.m. because only one person still had the number, and she hadn't used it in years. The message was short here: "Not crazy, Jace is alive. I saw him 2 days ago. I'll explain. No name, no location." But the number was Hersmara, the medic from his old unit, one who used to stitch him up while yelling at him in 3 languages and throwing for bags like grenades. The one who left without a word after the mission in Benghazi. When everything fell apart, he replied with a single word: "Where?" No response. He waited an hour, then burned the phone in a tin barrel behind the shed, because Mira would never risk texting unless she had no other option. And if she had seen Jace, then something had gone deeply wrong in places most people don't even know exist. By morning, he was driving, no plan, just the gut feeling that had kept him alive in more countries than he cared to count. He headed toward Denver because Myra always said if she ever had to disappear, that's where she'd go. Something about mountains and clean air, and being able to see people coming from miles away. The highways were long and empty, and his mind kept replaying the moment the shot was fired, the dog dropping, the sudden weight of grief that didn't feel like sadness, but something worse, something hollow and endless. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried since his brother's funeral when he was 13, and his father told him that tears were for men who had someone left to protect them. At a truck stop just outside Colorado, he noticed the same black SUV parked near the pump's engine off, windows tinted too dark to be legal. He walked past like he didn't care, but memorized the license plate and the slight scratch on the back bumper, because no detail was ever too small inside. The gas station, he bought black coffee and a map, even though he had GPS, because paper can't be hacked, and he liked the feel of something solid in his hands. When he came back out, the SUV was going. He checked his rearview mirror for the next 100 miles and never saw it again, but his spine stayed tight, like a wire pulled too hard for too long. In Denver, he checked into a small motel on the edge of the city, paid cash, used a name from an old passport, and sat in the room for 3 hours before the knock came through. Short, too long. The signal. Myra stepped inside before he could say anything and locked the door behind her like she hadn't forgotten every habit they learned in the sand. She looked older, thinner, more tired, but her eyes were the same, bright, sharp, and unafraid. She didn't hug him, just stood there and said, "I saw him, I swear." To God, Nash, I saw Jace Monroe walk out of a federal building wearing a badge and talking to people like he runs the place. Nash didn't answer. He just nodded once because she wouldn't lie, and because deep down he already knew. Mira dropped a folder on the bed, thin but heavy photos, documents. One blurry shot of Jace standing beside a black car talking to someone with a tablet in hand and a smile that looked more like a threat. She sat down on the edge of the bed and exhaled slow, like the weight of the truth had been crushing her for months. Dyer running something, Nash, something big and dirty, and I think your dog was just step one. That sentence hit harder than she probably meant because the image of that moment still sat in the back of his eyes like an afterburn. Opened the folder slowly, each page another piece of a puzzle that was starting to look a lot like a trap. There were reports of old operatives being reassigned without public records, photos of people he hadn't seen since the early 2000s, all now working quietly in government buildings under different names. A black op within a black OPA program that never ended. Diageo. Night wasn't shut down, it was privatized. Nash stood by the window again, staring at the city lights that blinked like quiet warnings. Why now? He asked, without turning. Why shoot my dog? Why draw me out? Myra's voice was softer now, almost afraid, because they need a fall guy. Nash, someone who can take the blame when this explodes, and you were perfect, buried, quiet, trained, skilled, but out of the system and off the radar. He clenched his jaw until it ached, because she was right, and he hated that she was right. She said she couldn't stay, said she'd already been followed twice, and didn't want to bring more heat to him. But before she left, she gave him one more thing: a key storage unit outside the city. I kept some things after Benghazi, in case we ever had to finish what we started. She was gone before dawn, like a ghost made of guilt and good intentions. Nash drove to the unit that morning, used the key, and found exactly what he expected: guns, tech blueprints, and one file marked with his name in handwriting he hadn't seen since 2012. Jace's handwriting inside was surveillance photos of Nash over the last 6 months, walking his dog, buying groceries, fixing his fence, sitting alone on the porch. Every photo was dated and timed, and one was circled in red. The date his dog was killed. That was no accident, that was no was the opening move in a game Nash didn't agree to play, but now had no choice but to finish. He sat on the floor of the storage unit, staring at the folder in his lap, and finally whispered the name that had been sitting on his tongue for days. Wasn't just going to find him, he was going to bring everything they built crashing down on his head, not for revenge, not even for justice, but because some things can't be left buried. Some monsters don't stay in the dark, and some men are too dangerous to be forgiven. The storage unit was cold and smelled like metal and dust, but Nash barely noticed because his heartbeat was louder than his thoughts, and every photo in that folder screamed of betrayal. Jace hadn't just survived, he had been watching. Meant this wasn't about Nash being a threat, this was personal. Nash sat on the concrete floor for what felt like hours, his back pressed to the wall, eyes locked on a picture of him and the dog at the river trail. A photo that could only have been taken from less than 20 feet away. They were that close. He stood slowly, his body moving like it remembered things before his mind did, and he packed everything with the calm precision of a man who had once been trained to dismantle lives without leaving fingerprints. Back at the motel, Nash stripped the burner phone into pieces and flushed the SIM card, because nothing was safe anymore, and everything felt wired to explode. He thought about Myra, where she was, if she made it out, if she had ever truly left the program, and for a brief second, the idea that she might be working with Jace flashed through his mind like a knife edge, but he pushed it away, because if he couldn't trust at least one person, then he was already dead. The next morning, he drove north toward Cheyenne, where the first Indigo night base had been built beneath an abandoned airstrip covered in federal camouflage and forgotten paperwork. It was the first place he ever held a gun in the dark and shot a target shaped like a man. It was where Jace had taught him how to disappear in plain sight, and where Mira had stitched his arm after a drill that went too far, and it was where the first real betrayal had started. He parked the car in a clearing 2 miles from the airstrip and walked the rest of the way through waist-high grass and ghost wind that felt like memory breathing down his neck. Fences were still there, but rusted and sagging, like the lies holding them up had started to rot. Slipped through a broken section and found the door hidden beneath the collapsed shed. Their keypad still worked, which surprised him more than it should have, and he entered the code without thinking, because some numbers never leave your bones. The door clicked and opened into darkness so thick it felt like walking into a cave that still remembered screams. He moved fast through the corridors because old instincts told him not to linger in places built to train killers. Most of the rooms were empty now, dust-covered, relics of a time that no longer officially existed, but one room still had power humming low and steady. Like a secret trying to breathe inside was a screen, one screen end, a camera feed of Myra tied to a chair, face bruised mouth, taped eyes wide and furious. She was alive, but she had been followed or betrayed, or maybe she had never even left the trap to begin with. The screen blinked once and then Jace's voice filled the room. Slow, smooth, cold like velvet, dipped in poison. You should have stayed, buried. Nash, we were ghosts, remember, and ghosts aren't supposed to come back. Nash didn't replay, didn't move, just stared at the screen like it might bleed if he looked hard enough. Jace continued, but since you're here, let's finish what we started. The screen cut to black. Nash exhaled, slow and steady, and walked out of that base with a plan forming in the spaces between rage and memory. He knew Jace knew how he thought, knew where he would hide, and how he would bait. This wasn't a battle, it was a purge. One man cleaning up the past so it couldn't speak again. By nightfall, Nash had found an old contact in Laramie, a hacker who owed him a favor from a long extraction gone wrong, and she pulled up records that should not have existed, property transactions under Shell Corporation's a private airfield in Nevada, medical facility in Utah that had no patients but took weekly government shipments, and, most importantly, a house, not just any house, a house built on a mountain off-grid, surrounded by motion sensors, registered to a dead man. Nash knew the pattern. Jace always liked high ground and tight perimeters. He liked to feel untouchable, so Nash made a choice. He was going there not to negotiate, not to ask questions, but to end. I drove all night through rain that fell like the sky was trying to drown the past, and through deserts where silence made his thoughts louder than his breathing. By dawn he saw it perched like a fortress above the cloud steel roof, no windows on the lower floor, cameras in every direction. He left the car half a mile down the slope and moved on foot, keeping low, letting the wind hide his steps and the sun blind the eyes that might be watching. He reached the fence just before noon and cut through it with a tool that hummed like a mosquito before giving way. He didn't rush, didn't flinch, didn't breathe too loud, because this wasn't war, it was surgery inside the house. It was colder than he expected, clean, sterile, full of shadows that didn't belong to found the first guard near the hallway, back turned, gun slung low, unaware. Nash didn't hesitate. He moved like memory, fast, silent, officially announced. The guard crumpled without a sound. Room by room he cleared the house until only one door remained closed, and humming like it had something to hide. He opened it slow and saw Hermiro live barely. She looked up, eyes burning not with fear but with relief that twisted into warning as her gaze shifted behind him. Nash turned fast, but not fast enough. The barrel of the gun pressed to his temple was warm like it had already been used, and Jace's voice was inches from his eye. Knew you'd come, you always were predictable. Nash didn't speak, didn't blink, just waited. Jace stepped closer, gun steady, smile thin and cruel. You could have walked away, but you chose this. You always choose the fight. Nash slowly raised his hands, palms out, not in surrender but by seconds. He turned slightly, locking eyes with Mira, and saw the flicker of movement as she worked at the rope with a piece of broken metal in her hand. Jace didn't notice, too focused, too arrogant, like all was you were never supposed to survive that mission. Nash, you were the loose end. Die buried everyone else, but you just kept breathing. So I waited and watched and took your dog because I knew that's what would bring you out. The words burned, but Nash didn't let them in. He just stared, waiting for the moment. Myra's hand slipped free. Nash moved fast, like lightning through fog. He twisted low, slammed his elbow back, and the gun fired once into the wall before falling. They struggled for control, but Nash was stronger, fueled by grief and betrayal, and the kind of quiet fury that doesn't burn out. Mira crawled to the gun, pulled it up, aimed with shaking hands, and hesitated for just a second because she had once trusted Jace too. Nash didn't hesitate. He struck, and Jace dropped, breathing, bleeding, but alive for now. Mira stood over him, gun still in hand. What do we do with him? She asked, voice raw. Nash didn't answer right away. He looked down at the man who had killed his team, stolen years of his life, and shot the only living creature that had ever given him peace. Then he looked at Myra and he said, we end it, tanned. This time there would be no coming back. Jace lay on the floor, breathing hard, eyes blinking like the light was too much for him, like he couldn't quite believe he had lost. Mira stood stood frozen above him, the gun still raised, but her hands shaking now, her lip bleeding from when he had hit her earlier. Her eyes, not angry, just empty, like all the years of running had finally caught up to her. Nash didn't speak at first. He just stared at Jace and then turned away, because looking at him felt like looking at something he should have killed long ago, something that festered in the dark because he thought mercy mattered more than justice. He crouched beside Mira and gently took the gun from her hand, not because he didn't trust her, but because she looked like she needed someone else to carry the weight. Now she whispered something low, something like he was supposed to be dead, and Nash didn't know if she meant Jace or herself, or maybe both. Just coughed and tried to smile, but there was blood on his teeth, and his voice was hoarse when he said, "You really think this ends?" Here Nash ignored him and started searching the room. Fast, methodical hands moving through drawers and shelves until he found Ita, laptop still warm from user flash drive already plugged in, a wall of files open on the screen, and folder names that brought old nightmares crawling back to the Surface project. Echo Nightfall rebooter set. Renewal. Every file was stamped with clearance levels Nash hadn't seen since his last mission, and each one contained names and faces and operations so dark the public would never believe them, even if they saw it on the news. Mirror looked over his shoulder and muttered, "They kept everything," and Nash nodded, because of course they did, because control isn't about truth, it's about leverage, and these files were insurance for people who never planned to leave power behind. Jace tried to sit up and winced as pain shot through his ribs, but the arrogance in his eyes never faded. He said, "You don't know what you're doing. You think this is revenge, but you're burning down a system that protects this country." And Nash turned to him and said, "This country doesn't shoot my dog and call it protection." Mira opened another file and froze, her fingers trembling over the mouse, and Nash saw her eyes fill with something he hadn't seen before. Not fear, not anger, but devastation. She clicked once, and the screen changed to a live feed from somewhere underground. Sterile walls and red lights, and cages inside. The cages were people sedated, restrained, experimented on, and some of them, they were not strangers. Nash leaned closer and recognized two faces from his original unit, men listed as killed in action, buried with empty coffins, honored with folded flags handed to mothers who never knew the truth. They were alive, barely used, like lab rats in whatever twisted continuation. Indigo night had become. Mira stepped back, covering her mouth as tears rolled down her cheeks, because she had known some of them too had eaten beside them, laughed, cried, bled in the same dirt, and now they were here. Forgotten, discarded, experimented on. US was laughing now, low and broken, but laughing because he knew they couldn't ignore it, and he said, "Go ahead. Expose it all, but you'll die before the upload hits 30%. And Nash knew he wasn't bluffing. There would be protocols, tripwires, failsafes was bigger than revenge. Now this was a reckoning. Nash pulled the flash drive from the laptop and looked at Myra, who had already started packing up whatever equipment could be moved quickly. "We get out first," Nash said, "then we bring it down together." They dragged Jace to his feet, cuffed his hands behind his back using restraints from the house's hidden security locker, and led him out into the pale morning light, where everything looked too normal, too quiet to clean. They loaded him into the back of the SUV, and Nash drove, while Myra sat beside him, her eyes on Jace, like if she blinked, he'd vanish, or worse, slip free and disappear again. The ride was long and silent, except for Jace, who kept talking, trying to make them doubt themselves, trying to poison their resolve, the way he always used to do in the field, when missions got too complicated and nerves got too thin. But this time, his words didn't land. This time, Nash wasn't the same man who followed orders and trusted authority. This time, Nash had buried something too sacred to ignore. They reached a safe house 2 states over. One Myra had kept in case the past ever came clawing back, and there they tied Jace to a steel chair in the basement, with chains, not ropes, because chains don't fray when panic sets in. Mira started going through the files on the flash drive, while Nash checked every entry, cross-referencing names with graves he had visited and missions. He remembered more faces appeared, more lies unraveled, and then one folder opened, and everything stopped. Inside was a full psychological profile of Nash, dated 6 months ago, with annotations, directives, behavioral notes. It wasn't just surveillance, it was manipulation. The shooting of the dog was planned, not just to lure him out, but to push him over the edge, to test whether he could still be broken, whether he could be turned back into a weapon for them. The grief wasn't an accident, it was a calculation. Mira read the file in silence, her face pale and fists clenched, and Nash sat down slowly, because something inside him cracked, something deeper than rage, deeper than grief. Jace had never stopped controlling the game, even from the shadows, even from the dead. He looked at Jace, who was smiling with one side of his mouth, and Nash walked over, slowly crouched down and whispered, "You forgot one thing about Majachi." Blinked. Nash leaned closer. "You never taught me how to quit then." He stood up and walked out of the room without another word, because Jace didn't deserve them, and because Nash had work to do. And Mira spent the next 6 hours uploading the files to 4 different dead drop locations using VPN chains so twisted not even God could follow them. And when they finished, they wrote a letter, not to the government, not to the government, not to the media, but to the families, the mothers, the brothers, the wives and sons and daughters, who had been fed lies for years. The truth was brutal, unbelievable, terrifying, but it was theirs, and they deserved to hold it. Joss never spoke again, not when they drove him to the edge of the state line, not when Nash handed him a phone and told him to run, not when Nash turned his back and gave him 10 seconds before drawing his weapon again, because sometimes mercy is the crueler choice, and Nash wanted him to live, not free, not forgiven, but hunted every day by the truth he could no longer bury. They left him there on a dirt road between nowhere and retribution and drove away into the dark. Mirror stared out the window as trees passed like ghosts and whispered, "Do you think it's over?" Nash didn't answer because he knew better. The past doesn't end, it waits. But for the first time in years, he felt something shift, not peace, not yet, but purpose, and sometimes that's enough. The motel room was quiet, except for the low static hum of the TV playing news that no one was watching, because Nash and Mira were focused on the laptop screen where the uploads were at 87% and still climbing. They had spent the last 3 days bouncing from town to town, hiding in plain sight, using burner phones and cash, only speaking when necessary, because silence was safer. And both of them knew that the moment the files went live, their names would be written in red ink on every shadow list from DC to the desert. Mira was tired, but something about her eyes had changed. They weren't just alert, they were alive, like seeing the truth finally bleed into daylight had reminded her that fighting wasn't just surviving, it was about meaning and maybe redemption too. Nash barely slept in those days, his mind always scanning, always searching for the next move, because he didn't believe in clean escapes, and he didn't trust quiet moments, not when ghosts like Jace had proven how far the system would go to silence the past. The morning the final upload hit 100%, Myra made a copy and mailed it to a journalist she once trusted, a woman who owed her a favor from a war zone long forgotten by headlines and policymakers. She dropped it in a blue mailbox outside a gas station in Wyoming, and when she got back into the car, she looked at Nash and said, "It's done," but the way her voice shook just a little meant they both knew it was only beginning. By nightfall, the stories started to break. A whisper on one conspiracy forum, a leaked document on an encrypted blog, a grainy photo of one of the test subjects still in uniform, strapped to a metal table, eyes wide with something worse than fear. The reactions were fast and brutal. Denial from officials, outrage from families, silence from everyone else. But the fire had started. Fires do not obey men, they just burn. Mira watched it unfold from behind glass, as if witnessing a world she once belonged to, and Nash watched her because he didn't trust what came next, not from them, not from her, not even from himself. 2 days later, the safe house was breached. 3 men in tactical gear moved like wolves through the shadows, and Nash took 2 down before they breached the hallway, and Mira finished the 3rd with a shot that echoed like thunder in a church they left that night, covered in blood that wasn't theirs, and wearing new identities, because they knew that retaliation wouldn't stop, and because Jace had never been the top of the food chain, just the leash for a much larger beast. In the back seat of the car, Mira said she had a name, not just a name, name the one who funded Indigo Night. From the beginning, the one who pulled strings and signed off on death like it was paperwork, the one who made sure Jace stayed alive and Nash stayed buried. Colonel Abram Royce Reed, a man who still attended high-clearance meetings in back rooms where laws were written in whispers, and people like Mira and Nash were classified as assets, not humans. Nash stared at the road and didn't speak because he remembered Royce from one mission only, and it had ended in fire and betrayal, and Bodhi's never recovered. Royce had looked him in the eye and said, "The world doesn't run on justice, son, it runs on control, and you better decide fast which side you want to be on." Now Nash had decided, and he wanted Royce. They tracked him to Montana, a private estate carved into the forest surrounded by ex-military contractors, and surveillance tech so advanced it could probably read thoughts. Mira said it was suicide. Nash said it was necessary. They planned for 3 days. They mapped the area, watched routines, noted weak spots, and programmed the security feed to loop at a specific hour when the guards changed shifts and the dogs were kept inside. On the 4th night, they moved through trees, darker than memory, or cross gravel so quiet it screamed in their ears, through an underground access shaft used for emergency evacuation, something only someone like Mira would know how to find inside. The estate was colder than expected and filled with the kind of art-rich men to pretend they have souls. They found Royce in his study drinking whiskey, older than most governments, and watching a security feed of Washington like he was still pulling strings from the shadows. He looked up and smiled when Nash entered, not surprised, not afraid, just amused, like a teacher watching a student finally understand the lesson. He said, "I knew you'd come eventually, and I must say, I'm impressed it took you this long." Nash didn't answer, just stepped closer, gun lowered, but eyes sharp. Royce motioned to the chair and said, "Sit. If you plan to kill me, you should at least listen first." And Myra said, "We're not here to listen, we're here to finish this." Royce sighed and sipped his drink and said, "You think exposing Indigo Night did anything? You think those files matter? They'll bury it again in a month. Call it rogue actors, or foreign manipulation, or psychological warfare." He stood slowly and faced them, his face lined with age but his voice still sharp. "You don't stop machines like this with truth. You stop them with something bigger: fear, chaos, power. And you don't have any of those things." Nash stepped forward and said, "I have something better. I have nothing to lose." And he pulled the second flash drive from his pocket, this one not filled with files but with code. Myra had written it herself in a motel while Nash watched the Dore kill switch, a program that would shred every server, every backup, every hidden vault tied to Indigo Night, and every operation it spawned. Royce's eyes changed then, not fear but calculation, like he was measuring the threat and realizing, maybe for the first time, that he had underestimated the very people he trained to disappear. He said, "You do this and you'll be hunted forever." Nash said, "I already am." Then he plugged the drive into Royce's terminal and pressed enter. The screen went black. The system began to erase itself line by line like fire through a forest. Royce lunged then, but Mira shot him in the leg, and he fell hard, cursing. His blood soaked into his perfect carpet. Nash knelt beside him and whispered, "This is for the team. You buried the truth, you silenced, and the dog you used as bait." Then he stood, turned and walked out with Mira as the estate behind them lit up with alarms and fire and the sound of an empire dying in silence. Disappeared after that. No records, no traces, only rumors. Some said Nash went south, changed his name, started a new life by the ocean. Others claimed Mira joined a new unit overseas, helping victims of the very programs she once helped build. But no one knows for sure, because ghosts like them do not leave trails, they leave legends. And in the quiet moments between stories and silence, there is always someone who remembers, a man with nothing left who burned down an empire, not for revenge, but for truth, and for a dog who never stopped believing. The ocean stretched in every direction, wide and endless, and blue, like it had never held pain, like it had never seen war, or betrayal, or loss. And that was exactly why Nash had come to it, because he needed something that did not remember him. The small town he had settled in barely had a name, and the people barely asked questions, which made it perfect for a man who had given up every version of himself he had ever been forced to become. He worked at the docks, mostly quiet, lifting crates, mending nets, hauling in boats under the weight of sun and salt and wind that didn't judge him, and he spoke only when needed, which meant rarely, because silence was his oldest friend. Every night he walked the same stretch of sand just after sunset, barefoot, through the tide until the sky went black and the stars came out, and he would look up and wonder what the others would think if they could see him now, the ones who never made it back, the ones buried in files and lies and empty graves. He would think of Myra sometimes too, how she vanished without warning one morning, leaving nothing but a folded note and a photo. From their unit days creased at the corners, like a memory too heavy to keep in a pocket. The note had said, "I have to go, but you did it. Nash, you really did it. Now live before they steal that from you." Too. So he stayed and he tried, and some days were harder than others. On the hardest days he would return to that single snapshot of the dog, the one he had carried through every mission, every escape, every safe house and hotel room, and finally framed in the corner of his cabin near the window where The sun hit it just right. People asked once or twice if he had a family, and he always said not anymore, but once, and they would nod and never ask again. Because grief has a language, even strangers can understand. One morning while mending a broken chain on the pier, he saw a black Jeep roll in from the East Road, slow, deliberate tires crunching, gravel like something familiar, something forgotten, and he stood very still as a woman stepped out, wearing sunglasses and a leather jacket to warm for this weather, and a grin too familiar to be imagined by her, leave and unburied. He didn't speak, and neither did she, not at first. They just stood there like two chapters that had never been closed, and after a long while she said, "I found something," and held out a small drive between two fingers. He took it without asking. They walked to the cabin and sat in silence, while the waves whispered through the window, and the kettle boiled without being touched. When the laptop opened, the screen flickered, and a file blinked to life. Not from the past, from the present. A name appeared on the screen. Name they thought had died in fire and ashes, and secret. Jace Monroe confirmed, alive, operating under a new identity in a foreign government, not rogue, not hunted, but protected. Mira didn't speak. She didn't have to, because Nash already knew the war wasn't over. The ghosts had only changed uniforms, but something in him resisted the old pull, the old fire, the old need to chase and burn and finish, because for the first time in his life he had built something quiet, something still. He asked her, "What do you want to do?" and she looked at him, not like a soldier, not like an agent, but like a human, and said, "Maybe nothing, maybe just let the world spin, maybe let someone else carry the weight." For once he closed the laptop slowly, like putting a weapon back in its case, and stared out the window at the sea, which did not demand anything from him, which did not care who he used to be. That night they sat by a fire near the dunes, no words, just the sound of crackling wood and distant waves and stars falling silently behind thin clouds, and she leaned against his shoulder, like she had done once before, long ago, before everything broke. He whispered, "Do you ever think we were supposed to be normal?" And she laughed, soft and bitter, and said, "I think we were supposed to be dead, and maybe this is the next best thing." The fire burned low, and the night stretched wide, and they sat there long after the flames died, because sometimes silence is the only truth that matters, and sometimes healing is not loud, or fast, or easy. It is choosing not to go back, it's choosing to live anyway. The next morning she was gone again. No note, no goodbye, just a cup of coffee left on the railing still warm, and a message burned into his mind that he was not alone, and never had been. He watched the sun rise slow and heavy and golden, and felt something shift deep in his chest, something that didn't hurt. He walked down to the shore, bare feet sinking into wet sand, the wind cool and soft, and he looked up into the wide sky and whispered to no one and to everyone, "I am still here," and that was enough. The end.